the deer panteth for the water, so my soul longs after thee. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship thee. You alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone may my spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship thee.
Shalom, welcome to another explanation of God, who is presented as a mother who provides food for her children. God gave manna and the quails. Now, I would like to attempt an explanation which may appear scandalous for some people who hear it for the first time. But what I am giving is the official explanation found in most of the commentaries, including the most authoritative one volume Catholic commentary, the New Jerome Bible Commentary. We already read that manna is a flaky substance as fine as frost on the ground. Remember, I mentioned earlier many of the incidents in the Exodus are extraordinary concurrence of ordinary events. Manna is like a honey, like dropping from the tamarisk tree of Palestine and Sinai, which the Bedouins of Sinai even today call man. Manna is a white, fluffy substance secreted by desert creatures that feed on tender tamarisk leaves. Recent discoveries have shown that this is the excretion of two kinds of scale insects. They are found, they are named zoologically as Trabutina mannipara and Niochus serpentinus. From the name itself, it may look like a little serpent. They suck large quantities of liquid from the twigs in spring in order to collect nitrogen for their grubs. This contains glucose and fructose, but no protein, and therefore cannot be harvested in quantity. These creatures feed on the tree's sap and repay the tree for its food by dropping the excretion on the ground. And it can be picked up after it has grown relatively hard in the cool of the night. This has a low melting point. It dissolves in the heat of the day, thus best gathered in the early morning. This has a sweet taste and is still a favorite food of the inhabitants of that area of the barren desert land. The Arabic word man denotes the plant insects we have just mentioned above, and the honeydew, which is a great delicacy, which is known as manessima. I would like to offer, of course, from the scholars, the second possible explanation. Both are found in a majority of commentaries. The second explanation is a type of plant lice, LICE, that punctures the fruit of the tamarisk tree, causing the fruit to excrete a yellowish white flake or ball, which is called manna. This disintegrates in the heat of the day and congeals in cold, become a semi solid, especially on cooling. It is sweet in taste, rich in sugars, decays quickly, and attracts ants. This manna was something new and surprising for the Israelites, coming from a predominantly agricultural land. The Bible portrays manna as miraculous because this is not an everyday occurrence. They got it when they lacked food. And the J writer designates this manna as given from heaven. They saw it coming from above. The Yahwist idea probably is very simple. Heaven in the Old Testament originally means the airspace above the earth. So, like a two-tier system, no? The earth, flat earth, and the heavens. So, Jeraita has the manna falling upon the earth like rain or dew. This statement later led to an even more spiritualization of manna when Psalm 18:24 and following called it as the grain from heaven and food of the angels. And much later, Paul, St. Paul, made an allusion to the manna in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 10, verse 3, with this expression in Greek, pneumatikon broma, spiritual food. Jesus would go further, explaining the manna as a type of the true bread from heaven, which gives life to the world. You can check in in the Gospel according to John 6:51, 6:27, and there are many, especially the entire chapter of uh, chapter 6 of John. What we find is the graciousness of God. When the Israelites were hungry, Yahweh answered their petitions for bread and meat by supplying them manna and the quail when they needed most. Centuries later, the psalmist will recall the tradition handed down to his generation. Psalm 105, verse 40. They asked for meat, and he sent them quail. He gave them manna, bread from heaven in abundance. They collected this manna with omer in verse 18. Omer is a small clay vessel which was used to collect manna. In collecting the manna, there was the remarkable fact however much or however little each man might have gathered, he still collected sufficient for the requirements of his family. God always gives, as Israel is meant to learn what is requisite for the needs of the moment, the daily bread, no less and no more. Verses 8, 77, and so on. Nothing is left for the next day. Manna is described as something like coriander seed, white in color, tastes like wafers made with honey. Verse 31. Let's go to Numbers chapter 11:8, a parallel passage. There, people ground the manna that they had gathered, making into cakes that tasted like um, original cakes baked with the oil. Yahweh commanded an omer of manna to be kept for the generations to come. This is so important in the history of salvation that future generations could see this bread Yahweh gave them in the desert. So, this memory will be carried on for the future generation. How God provided them with manna. So, part of this is kept. Aaron put the jar of Omer in front of the testimony, chapter 16, or the covenant, or the tablets of law, chapter 31. The covenant is represented by the tablets of law, and inside the ark, uh, the ark is kept inside. It's called the ark of the testimony, as in chapter 25. The stone tablets containing the 10 commandments were called the testimony, chapter 31, verse 18. Placing the jar of manna in front of this testimony might have meant placing it in front of stone tablets inside the ark. In reality, no ark had been made, and the commandments had not been given to Moses in two tablets at this time when manna was given. This is another example of anachronism, the action of attributing something to a period to which it does not belong. But the theological resonance is so important that this manna is kept almost as, or not in line with the Ark of the Covenant. Aaron's rod also was kept in front of the testimony according to book of Numbers chapter 17:10. The Lord said to Moses, "Put back the staff of Aaron before the testimony, to be kept as a sign for the rebels, that you may make an end of their grumbling against me, lest they die." When you look at uh, first book of Kings, chapter 8, verse 9, and second Chronicles, chapter 5, verse 10, which say that there was nothing in the ark except the two stone tablets. In the New Testament, the vision of the ark containing the gold jar of manna together with the Aaron staff that had budded and the stone tablets of the covenant, according to Hebrews, letter to the Hebrews, chapter 9, verse 4. What is the Jewish tradition? According to the long standing Jewish tradition, Jeremiah has taken and kept the ark with its contents before the destruction of the temple that took place in 587 BC. It will be seen again only at the arrival of the Messiah. Revelation chapter 11, verse 19. John had seen the ark in the temple in his vision. John chapter 6, verse 25. Jesus is the bread from heaven that gives true life to humanity. The jar of manna kept for later generations anticipates the Christian tabernacle where the Eucharistic bread is being kept for those who are absent from the celebration of the local faith community, that they will be nourished later by this food from heaven due to sickness or disability or old age, when they cannot be present for the common function. They are given later. Israelites were given manna about a month after they departed from Egypt, according to the text. They ate it during the entire 40 years of their sojourn in the wilderness, according to chapter 16, verse 36, 35. They ate manna for 40 years. And immediately after they entered the promised land under the leadership of Joshua, Joshua chapter 5, verse 10 to 12, manna stopped. Now they have to cultivate and make their bread. That takes us to the third test. Water from the rock. Grumbling at Massa and Meribah. Chapter 17, 1 to 17. The trying experience, which is similar to the Mara incident. But here also we have the tradition of God's graciousness to his people. In chapter 15, 20 to 27, the people could not drink the bitter water after searching for 3 days. Now there is no water at all. They do not believe that he can feed them. That means Yahweh cannot be their God in the wilderness. He is not able to give them water. Now, if you omit verse 2, which is the people's attack on Yahweh, the rest appears as a quarrel with Moses and demands that he meet the needs of the people. At this point, Moses cries to Yahweh. The cry of Moses in verse 4 is very similar to his demand in chapter 14, verse 15. In chapter 17, verse 4, so Moses cried out to God, "What shall I do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." The answer from the Lord is positive. Verse 5. The Lord said to Moses, "Go on ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. Moses is commanded to strike the rock with his staff. The elders in this passage represent the people, and they are the witness to what is going to take place. Once again, Yahweh meets the needs of the people. At this moment, the dire need of the people is water. Please note, in verse 5, there is no indication of any punishment, because in the book of Numbers, the interpretation will be different. The final verse in this section, chapter 7, chapter 17, verse 7, he gave the place the name Massa and Meribah. The Israelites' contentiousness, and because they put Yahweh to the test by saying, is Yahweh with us or not? That sums up perfectly what it means to test God. Massa and Meribah. Massa and Meribah, because they quarreled and rebelled against God. We have this tradition of rebellion. Here, the central focus is not the thirst. The thirst serves as a backdrop for the theme of rebellion for coming out of Egypt. Why did you ever make us leave Egypt? We already saw it earlier. So, Exodus is the object of attack for some Israelites. So now the place is named both Massa and Meribah. Massa from the Hebrew word meaning test. Meribah meaning finding fault. In the NRSV gives a footnote for both. This is that site of the dispute about the water at the end of the journey in chapter 10, verses 1 to 13. These two names, Massa and Meribah, became memorials of the faithlessness of Israel. This will be repeated in Deuteronomy 6:16, 9:22, 33:8, Psalm 95:8. Psalm 95:8. O Lord, hasten your hearts as at Meribah. Harden not your hearts as at Meribah, and the day at Massa in the wilderness, when your fathers put me to the test and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work. Meribah was one of the springs at Kadesh, according to Numbers chapter 20, verse 13. Mara and Massa were evidently springs at the same oasis, and this was present when author wrote this part of the Exodus. The complaint stories stress Moses as a prophetic mediator between the Lord and the people. So, as a mediator, as a prophetic mediator, Moses pleads before the Lord. The Lord answers. In the rain-starved Middle East, water then and now is a source of strife, very evident in Exodus chapter 2:17. So this section ends on the assumption that the people are satisfied. Moses acts correctly, which is in contrast with Numbers chapter 20, verse 11 to 13, where in the Numbers, this act of Moses is taken as disobedience, because of which, according to the book of Numbers, Moses is prevented from entering the promised land. And this account contrasts with that of the account in Numbers. So that shows the contrasting purpose of each of this book. While graciousness is the highlight in Exodus, disappointment is the focus of the story in the book of Numbers. Water plays a major role in the book of Exodus. Remember Pharaoh's order to throw all male children into the Nile, chapter 1, verse 22. And this water of Nile becomes the space for the salvation, or the salvation of Moses, chapter 2, verse 2 to 10. And later, he would feed the flock of the Midianite priest and gets hospitality and his future wife. Again, you remember, the first plague involved water turning into blood and making a way through the waters of Yam Suf, Sea of Reeds or Red Sea, saved Israel from Egyptian forces. And after the crossing, Moses and Miriam sang the song of the sea in chapter 15. What a problem that we have just discussed in the life of Israel at Mara. Water was bitter. Chapter 15:22, that water turned into sweetness. At Rephidim, the last incident, Yahweh providing water from the rock, chapter 17, 1 to 7. The conclusion, Yahweh gives bread from heaven and water from the rock for his people in the wilderness. He thus proves his mastery over the hostile environment. That takes us to the last part of today's episode, the defeat of the Amalekites in chapter 17, verses 8 to 16. We come across a narrative extolling a great human accomplishment in the midst of the awesome display of divine power. What is the purpose? To edify the heroic stature of Moses. While salvation involves an interplay of divine grace and human cooperation, it is reassuring to note a story where the limelight falls on the human protagonist. The role of Moses is very well highlighted. Who are these Amalekites? They are a fierce desert tribe that claimed control of the wilderness in the region of Kadesh, according to Genesis chapter 14, Numbers chapter 13. This story explains Israel's implacable hatred of the Amalekites and the origin of a particular altar, which we often called as etiology, explanation of the origin. The entire movement centers on Moses, and this time not much on Yahweh. Moses commissions Joshua to make the battle prepared, or to make the battle preparations, and he takes up the preparations on a nearby hill. Moses goes to the nearby hill. And in the story, Moses defeats the Amalekites by stretching out over them the rod he used to defeat Pharaoh. Now, Yahweh fights for Israel whenever the rod is raised. The physical fatigue of Moses in verse 12 prepares us for what is going to take place in chapter 18, verse 18. Verse 17, chapter verse 17, 22. Moses' arms finally became too tired to hold up the staff any longer. So Aaron and Hur found a stone for him to sit down, and they stood on each side, holding up his hands until sunset. 18:18. You will surely wear yourself out, both you and these people with you, for the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. So, chapter 18 and this chapter 17, 12, they speak about the fatigue of Moses. However, the rod works the miracle. The same word describes his inability to function without sharing the authority that leads him to choose 40 choose people who will help him out in his mission. This heroic dimension of Moses is captured by the expression steady hands. This steadiness described in the account is the faithfulness shown in fulfilling the official task. It is the courage of this one man that turns the tide of battle. For all his failings, Moses retains his image as hero and superman. So, with this conclusion of Moses as a hero and superman working with God and God working him, we see the graciousness and the goodness of God. And we will see the role of Joshua in the next episode. Till then, God be with you. Shalom.
Thank you, Lord, for the gift and love of your sacred word. Open our hearts to put into practice that which you have revealed to us through your word. Amen.